Welcome to Conversations in a Vintage Shop, a podcast from behind my counter between customers. Join me while I sit behind my retail counter and just have a conversation with you, or with myself. While I look out the window, observe what I see, things that are happening in the store today, throughout the week, and just fun little stories that I have from my time as a business owner. This is something that you find interesting, then keep listening, and I appreciate you. Hey everyone, welcome to episode 5 of Conversations in a Vintage Shop, a podcast where it's like a virtual hangout in my vintage shop, having conversations that I have with customers every day. And as of today's recording, I have not yet chosen a title for this episode because it's kind of just going to be a stream of consciousness. Things that have been happening in the shop lately, interesting articles about vintage that I've been reading and have a lot on my mind about. So I thought this would just be an episode where it's kind of like a massive mind dump of things I'm thinking about and want to see how you all feel about it. So if you want to hear my stream of consciousness and all of my unadulterated ramblings, you might have heard my phone just went off, then keep listening. Since starting this podcast, I've honestly, and I don't mean to be self-deprecating, but I really didn't think anybody would listen to my random little podcast and the things that I say. And I've been noticing that people have been listening. And A, I appreciate it more than words can say. And B, I didn't expect it. But one of the things that I've been really enjoying talking about are people that have reached out to me who listened to my very first episode about being a small business owner with ADHD and how that's affected me personally and my business. And I wanted to do a little bit of a check-in because it's my 4th week on ADHD medication. And I think it's important to keep the conversation going about it and being honest, because a lot of people have ADHD, and again, it's one of those things that's highly stigmatized. So to make something have less of a stigma attached to it, you have to keep talking about it and you have to keep it fresh, and it is normal. This is normal life for a lot of us who have it. So my experiences so far being on the ADHD medication, the first couple weeks were amazing, especially the first 4 days. I was getting things done. I wasn't jittery. I wasn't, you have this stereotypical view of how people either use or abuse ADHD medication and they're bouncing off the walls and they're going a mile a minute. I didn't have that experience. With me, it's been, I want to do something and I do it. I don't have any hesitation or question why I'm doing something nearly as much as I used to. So for example, I have projects at work that I want to get done. And it used to be, I would go down the list and look at certain items and think, I don't feel like doing this today. I'll leave it till tomorrow, or I just don't have the motivation or the ideas. Whereas now I can have a list and I get things done. I may not get them done as quickly as I did in the first week or 2 of being on the medication, but they're getting done. But I have kind of hit that plateau, which I was warned about, where you're not going to feel as great and motivated as you did maybe the first week or 2. And your experience with it after maybe a month is going to be more of how you are regularly going to be, if that makes sense. So now I have to actually just do things and not use the medication or anything as an excuse on whether or not I can or can't do it. But it's been good so far, and I have no complaints. I'm trying to take more ownership of my decisions and how I get day-to-day things done in my life and in the shop, and trying to become more aware of what I'm doing. So that is just kind of a brief update on how my ADHD journey is going. And I'm excited I can share it with you guys, and those of you who are struggling with it as well. As a small business owner, it's really hard. It's really hard, and I wish more people could understand that it's not as easy as just flipping an on and off switch in your brain to where I can turn this anxiety off. I can turn on my motivation. It's a lot more work than that, and sometimes just getting to that point is so mentally exhausting. You just feel like you're in kind of that never-ending cycle. So here's hoping. It's the holiday season coming up. We need all the energy we can get. So just take care of yourselves and take care of your brain and your space, and do a lot more self-care, which is something I'm trying to get better at every day. I'm failing at it, but I'm trying. I came across an article recently that really caught my eye, and it had to do with vintage fashion. And I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but do you ever come across an article, you read the title, and you expect it to be about one thing, but as you read it, it's about something totally different? That was this article. And this article came from the BBC, and it was written by Belle Jacobs. And the title of the article, I'm just pulling it up, is Why Buying Vintage Clothes is Quote Unquote the New Luxury. And I'll explain what the article's about, and then I'll go over what I assumed it was going to be about. And in this article, they talk to a lot of people in the fashion industry about the shift in fashion where people are leaning more towards secondhand, pre-loved clothing and vintage, and how that's becoming a really big driving force in the fashion industry in terms of money. They did a projection and a report from the popular e-commerce secondhand site ThredUp. And they say that they, in the next few years, project that they're going to go from $24 billion in revenue to being a $51 billion company. And that's a huge jump in just 2-3 years. And they said it's because people are becoming more socially aware, and they're realizing how harmful fast fashion is to our environment. And really, it was a great article showing a lot of statistics for people who really like numbers and like seeing in real time how the fashion industry really does have a key role in the environment and the wellness of every person on this planet. So reading down the article, I was really trying to key in on what the title had promised, asking if vintage was going to be a new luxury. And I found this quote, and I'm scrolling down to see if I can find it, because I want to read it word for word. All right, and this quote came from a New York-based creative director named Bryn Hemingway. And she had said, "My hope is that vintage becomes the new luxury and thrift becomes new streetwear. For the sake of the planet, it has to be that way. Fashion is how we signal our intent." So what she's saying is, instead of people automatically just defaulting to going to Target, to going to Forever 21 for their clothing, she really wants people to go to thrift stores, go to secondhand stores, or, those stores where people bring their gently used clothing and just recycle it. We all, in all of our towns and cities, we have those places. and how she sees vintage as becoming kind of what we see as designer fashion today. Like everybody wants this Stella McCartney dress, and maybe you'll invest in it and it'll be kind of your holy grail piece. But then the rest of your closet is filled with, pieces from Kohl's or the Gap or I don't know, wherever the young folks shop nowadays. And that quote really struck me because I had thought this article was going to lean more towards how vintage is really becoming, in some aspects, inflated, and how it's becoming more and more expensive to acquire vintage items. And this quote was a really interesting tie-in to my assumption about what this article was going to be about, because it brought up really two really great points. How we want people to be more conscious about what they're buying, and instead of buying something new that's mass-produced, buy things that are already out there, that already exist. And that's why I love vintage. Those are pieces that are already existing and in existence, and they've been here for 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, whatever plus years. But a problem that I see arising from that mentality, which again, I think is great, but it's something that I'm noticing a lot more in the vintage community, and I've had customers notice it as well. And that's the inflation of prices when it comes to vintage. And I always tell people, because you go from vintage shop to vintage shop, from city to city, and you'll notice there are huge discrepancies in prices for certain items. I had a woman come in from Los Angeles, and she was looking at a rack of some of the 1950s, 1960s dresses I have. And I mean, depending on what it is, it can range anywhere from $26, $34, $44. I mean, if it's just your standard non-designer label vintage. And she had said that for a lot of these things back in LA, she would be paying minimum $80, $90, $100 for these pieces. And how she was so confused as to why there's this huge discrepancy. And I mean, there are a lot of reasons for that. Location, it's obviously a higher cost of living in LA, so of course you're going to be paying higher prices for really anything there. I mean, that's just a fact. But another important thing to remember is in vintage, it's not like antiques where you can bring it in to an appraiser, and whether you have an 1800s grandfather clock and you have the market showing how much that is worth. Vintage clothing is a little bit different. And again, I'm not an expert in that field and appraisals. That's not my cup of tea. But in vintage clothing, it's so unique in the fact that all these things mean different things to different people. You can have, let me think, just a dress from, let's say, Lily Diamond. Really popular designer in the 1950s and 60s. And in one place, you may be able to buy one of her cocktail dresses for $60. But maybe you go on Etsy, an e-commerce site, and you see that price jump up to $250, $300. And sometimes it has to do, especially if you're buying online, seller's fees that you get from being on kind of that marketplace e-commerce site. But there are some vintage sellers that they set the price, and it has nothing to do with what they see as being a fair price and what things have sold for. They set what they want from it and what they place the value on. And you see that a lot of times. As a vintage buyer, I'll have people bring pieces in, and whether it be their sentimental value, memories attached to it, they see a piece as being way more valuable than what it actually is. So that's part of it as well. But I've also seen, and this is something that it's a little bit trickier to spot, but I've noticed it, and it's becoming a little bit more prevalent, There are vintage buyers that buy pieces for very close to market value and then resell them for double. Now, how does that make sense? You're asking the wrong person. It's something I've noticed. So it's really the wild, wild west in terms of pricing. And again, there are vintage shops that are very popular. They have hundreds and thousands of followers. They have a really big following. So you kind of go into, I call it that designer effect, where you put a name on it and it supposedly becomes more valuable. It's really interesting, and this is veering a little bit off topic, but I kind of relate it to makeup and in the makeup industry. You get a lot of makeup businesses doing private label production on, let's say, a lot of their eyeshadow palettes. Now, if you have a big name company that goes to this one factory, they put their name on it and they can charge $60, $70 for a palette. You have a smaller indie brand that purchases from the same private labeler, and because they're unknown, maybe you get $25, $30 for the palette. That happens in vintage too. There are many, many sellers that I have bought from in the past that now that they've gotten bigger and more well-known, their prices have skyrocketed. Whether it's a fair price for what they're selling, I'll let you guys be the judge for that. Again, it's all subjective. But that ties it back to that quote, and kind of my fear in vintage is that vintage is slowly going to become inaccessible to the everyday person. And slowly, it's becoming an industry where only the wealthy or the people that have money are going to be able to secure these pieces. Even if they're not designer, it could be an obscure 1960s piece. But if you jack up the price, you're eliminating a lot of the customers that would probably buy it. So that's really what I've been interested in. Is if we do have a market where, let's say, fast fashion brands are kind of the rarity, and you go into full throttle, a secondhand thrifting world for your everyday wear, and then vintage becomes that coveted thing where you're going to be spending hundreds and thousands of dollars on a piece. Is that good? Because prices will go up for things. When there's high demand, prices go up. And you see that currently with people on Poshmark or eBay, who they go to thrift shops, they buy clothing pieces, modern clothing pieces, and they go online and resell them. And then the prices go up because that is what's popular right now. That is a hot market. So you have the rise of not just vintage resellers, but clothing resellers. And I feel like slowly are the days of going to a thrift store and finding that rare, cool vintage piece for $5, $10, or finding the diamond in the rough, a designer piece at a thrift store. We're slowly veering away from that to where I really do think we're headed to that market where this is going to be the new standard. And with a new standard and more demand, you get price increases. But that's just kind of my long-winded thought on that article, and I'm curious what you guys think about that. Do you feel like vintage is something that is slowly becoming inaccessible to you? Have you noticed prices going up? Have you asked why prices are going up? I have had customers ask, why do you price this piece like this and this piece a different price? And those are fair questions, and you should be asking it. And 9 times out of 10, we'll have an answer for you. But it's a curious and really interesting environment that we're finding ourselves in, where people are paying more attention and being more socially conscious. But with that, becomes mainstream. And with things that become mainstream, you're going to see a whole new world of fashion and what's going to be available to the everyday consumer. But it's an interesting article, and it really got me thinking about the trajectory of mainly vintage. I'm looking at it from a vintage aspect. I don't do a lot of modern clothing shopping. There are people who are so much more knowledgeable about the thrift and secondhand and pre-loved clothing industry than I am. I'm just speaking in terms of what I know through vintage. And I really hope it doesn't get to that point where a lot of these pieces aren't going to be attainable and they're going to become a scarcity in the prices that we currently see. But that's just my 2 cents, and that was something I was really thinking about today, and a question I've been getting a lot, and now I feel like I'm slowly starting to attempt to formulate an answer for how I feel about that and where I see this going in the future. I'm going to circle back a bit because I realized to fully understand that article and what I was talking about, it's really good to know the difference between what's considered vintage and what's considered secondhand. I do a lot of times have people come into my shop, and I know a lot of other vintage shops have had the same thing happen, where you'll have a customer come in who's never been in your store and will ask, oh, is this a secondhand store? Is this a thrift store? And I know I'll tell people, oh, nope, it's a vintage store. And they don't understand what the difference is. So vintage is considered about anything from 25 years to 50, 60 years old from the current date. So for example, it's November 3rd today when I'm recording this. 25 years ago today would be 1996. So anything pre-1996 would to most be considered vintage, although some vintage sellers see anything up to 1999 as being vintage, so you give and take those few years. Whereas secondhand is anything comfortably that has been produced either recently, within the past year, 5 years to 10 years is kind of what I've seen most agreements on, things that are newer. Although I have had some people refer to vintage that was done in the 80s and especially the 90s as new vintage, which I think that tends to kind of confuse people even more. But I thought that was a really important thing to highlight because I know growing up, when I went to thrift shops, you would find vintage pieces there along with all of the regular thrifted pieces. But more often than not, you always were finding vintage things at thrift stores. So now I have people coming in who are either my age or older, where vintage shops, when they were going up, or thrift shops, when they were growing up, predominantly had vintage things that people were getting rid of because vintage wasn't as popular back then. Flash forward to now, you're very lucky if you still find vintage pieces at a thrift store. Mainly you're going to find newer, more recently made clothing. So I thought that was just something really important to highlight and define. What really is vintage and what is secondhand? Why are they different? And when you go into a vintage shop, sometimes, and I know I've been guilty of it, when someone asks if I'm a thrift store, sometimes I get a wee bit offended. Not that I have anything against thrift stores, but I know in my shop, I work really hard to pick pieces that are of a certain era. And if I do get anything that's new, it'll be listed on the tag. Because I admit there are pieces where you'll see online it's Y2K era. That just means it's modern. 2000s, early 2000s, mid 2000s. And sometimes I'll get pieces in, like I have a couple of Betsy Johnson pieces that were early 2000s in the shop, and they're modern. However, I find them to be really classic, important pieces that, yes, they're not vintage, but they are iconic. So as long as you make that, what am I trying to say? Clarification for customers that yes, what you're buying is not vintage, but here's why I have it here. I think that's another really important thing where you're not trying to dupe someone, but instead let them know why you feel like that is a relevant article of clothing. So that's my take on it. And I apologize. I'm very congested. So if throughout this I've sounded kind of stuffed up and nasally, that's why. And allergies, you gotta love it. So I just wanted to interject that on the difference between those two whenever I reference it. Within the past couple of weeks, I begrudgingly started an Instagram for this podcast. I haven't gone over to Facebook yet. Facebook is something that I slowly want to start veering away from. It's just not doing it for me personally or professionally. I'm not a fan of it. So, if you want to keep up with new episodes and what we're going to be talking about next, head on over to Instagram and follow us at Conversations in a Vintage Shop. It's a long title, but should be able to remember it. And on there, I'm going to be doing some polls and seeing what you guys want to hear me talk about. We had a really great response to the question I asked for our last episode, or one of our last episodes about size inclusivity. And that's the kind of community that I love about this shop is you all can ask me questions. I love to talk. I love to talk to you. I want to see where you're at. I want to see what worries you and any questions you have. That's why I love it. When people come in here, customers turn into friends. And I feel like in a retail setting, tides are changing where it's not just a monetary experience, but you come into a shop, you come into a space, and you feel accepted, you feel welcome. I know it made a huge difference for me when I was growing up. I would sometimes skip class and come down to downtown Fargo and go to my favorite shops or coffee shops and just sit there because I didn't feel like I belonged anywhere else. And I wanted to create a space like that here. And that's what this podcast is about. If you can't physically come to me, I'm going to come to you. And we can have these conversations. So if that's something you want to be a part of, head on over. Ask me a question on Instagram. DM me whatever's on your mind. If there's an episode you want to see, that's the point. I want to talk about what you all want to talk about. Whether it's vintage, fashion, sex, mental health, anything. Anything. We talk about it all in the shop, believe it or not. But I want to thank you guys again for joining me. I know this was a random mishmash of things, and not every episode is going to be, aimed at one particular subject. Because sometimes I just have things on my mind and I want to talk about them. But I appreciate you being here and listening and giving me your time of day. And thank you. I'll see you next week.